Next Chapter Podcasts.
This is Michael Goodfriend, executive producer of the Play On podcasts. If you love books and travel, let me tell you about the podcast Strong Sense of Place. Every 2 weeks, hosts Melissa and Dave introduce a destination, then recommend books to transport you there on the page. Each episode is a new bookish adventure. Take an imaginary trek through Iceland or sip ouzo in Athens. They've been recommended by Book Riot and featured in Apple's top 10 podcasts for the arts. Listen to Strong Sense of Place on your favorite app or visit strongsenseofplace.com. Hi, my name is Michael Goodfriend, and I'm the executive producer of the Play On podcasts. Tracey Young is an accomplished theater director and playwright who began her writing career developing several original plays with the Actors Gang in Los Angeles, including the musicals Hysteria, which was an Ovation Award and Penn West finalist, Euphoria, which received the Ovation, LA Weekly, and Garland Awards, and A Fairy Tale, which received the Garland and Glad Image Awards. She's created several adaptations of classic plays and novels, including the critically acclaimed Candide, or The Optimistic Civil Servant, from Voltaire's Candide for Cornerstone Theatre Company, The Servant of Two Masters, and The Imaginary Invalid for the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, and most recently, a theatrical adaptation of Madeleine L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time for Oregon Shakespeare Festival. She co-created Medea Macbeth Cinderella with Bill Rausch, a simultaneous telling of Euripides' Medea, Shakespeare's Macbeth, and Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella, which she calls her most challenging and joyful work to date. That is, until she took on the Play On podcast series, The Winter's Tale. She's been awarded by the Connecticut Critics Circle for her work as a director and was a finalist for several prestigious playwriting awards. Tracey Young is the translator and director of the Play On podcast series, The Winter's Tale, and she's here with me now to talk about that project and, I hope, a whole lot more. Tracey, welcome to the Play On podcast bonus content series for The Winter's Tale.
Oh, it's thrilling to be here, Michael. Thank you so much. This is really fun.
We have been
already
laboring. Oh, good. You haven't even started talking yet, so I'll just keep talking.
And I'm already just overjoyed.
Right, so this will be the easiest interview in the world. I'll just talk.
Great. I'm wrapped. Go.
No, you and I have been laboring in the trenches on this epic tale. I mean, it is a true tale. It just goes everywhere and has all of these. I love to say that Shakespeare gives everybody the greatest impossibility exercises in all of literature. You know, you just trying to accomplish some of these transformations and changes. What is it about this play that captured your interest in the first place?
Oh, wow. Yeah. I mean, there's so much. You're right. And we have really been poring over this play for weeks and weeks now. And I've been, because of the Play On series, which I'm sure you've talked about more at length, what it all is, and its genesis many years ago, out of Oregon Shakespeare, that I've had the opportunity to sit with and marinate with this particular play, which was my choice, my most desired one out of the canon, to work on for the Play On series for, like, I don't know, maybe it's coming up on a decade now. I don't know. It's been a long time. So it's sort of funny because there's just so much I could say, and it's hard to pull back now and kind of boil it all down, you know? But I think the play is just extraordinary. And as you say, it's kind of got some attributes that are a little bit unique in Shakespeare's world of writing. Not the least of which is this funny thing where the play kind of divides into there are these handful of plays in the Shakespeare canon that people have called the problem plays, right? Because they sort of have a mix of comedic content and dramatic content all mashed up together. And it always is sort of, cracked me up because isn't that how life is? Like it's funny that they don't call them the reality plays because that's really what we're all kind of living through most of the time, isn't it? Sort of this improbable mashup of joy and sorrow and funny stuff, insanely funny stuff, and then real difficulties. And so this play has all of that, and on top of it, it has this funny flash forward in time thing that comes kind of midway through the play. We have the opening 3 acts of the play, and then the character called Time appears and says, you know what, we're going to actually fast forward 16 years and pick up again. Don't worry about it. Just trust me on this. It's going to be good. And that's a funny thing. And I'm not aware of that happening in any other of Shakespeare's plays. And it came from the original source material for the play, which was a play called Pandosto that was written a few decades before Shakespeare took on The Winter's Tale. Supposedly fairly late in his career, as people think. But so that's an interesting thing. And I just love as with most of his plays, the psychology of the characters is fascinating and rich. There's something so extraordinary about, why his plays persist in the public consciousness, I think, is because of the depth of his thinking about human nature and all the complexity of that and all the contradiction of that and the mystery of all that and love, the mystery of love and the mystery of how things can turn, how the heart can turn so sour at times, and the cruelty we're all, capable of under certain circumstances, and how our own minds become our enemies in certain ways at certain times. And also the healing that can happen and through forgiveness and self-forgiveness. And, these things are very relevant to us living now, as I think they were during his time. And so this play in particular kind of focuses a lot on what goes up inside of all of our brains, and how that can result in real life situations that are very high stakes. Mm-hmm. So I love all that. Is that too? And I could just go on and on. I don't want to give too long of an answer.
Well, it's all really interesting. I wonder is there a character that you relate to or a thing that you relate to in this play more than anything else? Is there something like a character or an event that really speaks to your heart of hearts?
Well, oh gosh, there's so much I could say. Let's see. Well, the character of Paulina is kind of the engine of the play. She's a noblewoman in the king's court. And there's a lot of debate about what's actually happening in the play, particularly in the final scene where this kind of magical moment happens. Some people would insist
Spoiler
that
alert. Spoiler alert.
Okay, spoiler
alert. If you
alert.
haven't heard the whole series yet, you may want to silence this part of the interview.
Yes. All right. I'm going to tread lightly on this. Okay.
Oh, no, don't worry.
So there's, this kind of this sort of miraculous thing that maybe happens at the end of the play, or maybe it's not so much miraculous as it is just a product of Paulina's tenacity and conviction in her trust in the healing power of love, the healing power of time, and a lot of other things. And so that's kind of one of the central things of the play. She's really a badass. She speaks truth to power. She is sort of undaunted by the trappings of power. And she works really hard to try to set things right in the play. So I think she's a fascinating character, excuse me. And I think that she makes the play fascinating. She's not thought of as sort of the lead character, but she really is in some ways the central character that makes that forces the action to all happen. So I find that character really fascinating. And then,
Played
of course,
sublimely, I might add, by KT Vogt in our production.
yes, KT Vogt, yes, who I love so much, and she's I worked with her several times at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. She's an incredible comedic actor, and she took on this role and really has brought also some ferocity to it that I've not seen her, have the opportunity to really bring before. So that's really cool. And then the character of Leontes, who really is considered sort of the central figure, played by Elijah Alexander, another just incredible actor, and your good pal, Michael. I'd love to hear some anecdotes about you and Elijah when you were boys. Tales when you were boys. But I'm fascinated with that character. And I don't know how much we want to speak about the plot of the play, but essentially the plot.
We can assume that folks who haven't heard the whole series, if they don't want to hear these spoilers, they can tune us out. But let's assume that everybody listening knows this play now at this point and has heard all the episodes. So just go for it.
Great. So this character, he's the king, and early on in the play, he sort of gets it in his mind that his best friend and his wife, the queen, have been unfaithful. There's been infidelity, perhaps even that the child that she's pregnant with is perhaps not his, but in fact his friend's. And this sort of drives him to a state of madness that causes him to have the queen thrown in prison, and his friend has to sort of steal away back to his own country. He's also a king of a neighboring country, and just tragedy ensues from that. But what happens is that the psychology of this character, why does he think this? How did he come to have such strong belief that the people he loves best in the world have actually betrayed him so thoroughly? And it's a real challenge for any actor taking on that role. And because Shakespeare actually gives very little runway to letting that character develop his paranoia and his sort of anger and so on. It just almost launches in somewhat abruptly and immediately from the very beginning of the play.
It happens early in our first episode.
Yes.
And my request, he would not. He wouldn't stay when I asked him to, and all of a sudden he's off to the races.
Exactly. And every time, they've been all three laughing and telling stories and enjoying each other's company, and then all of a sudden, every laugh that they share seems, conspiratorial. Seems like the queen and his friend are having a private laugh at his expense, and so it's powerful. It's an extreme emotional journey for any actor taking on that role. And my feeling about previous productions that I've seen, they're great, and there's usually a lot of intense emotionality, as there needs to be. And yet there's always been little things missing for me about that character and their journey, So it was a great opportunity to have this whole time with Elijah to investigate some of the other textures in that role.
And what are those textures? So you say that and when we've talked about this character, you've talked about how it is just a lot of times you just get railing, somebody just yelling and really just kind of losing his mind. What were you looking for in Elijah's performance, and how did he bring that out in this production?
And not to cast aspersions on any previous production, there've been great ones and all of that, and yet I would say that the thing, because of the way that the role is written, which really does sort of challenge any actor to get away from or make alternate choices than just sort of attacking, screaming and yelling, being enraged, threatening, etc. it really requires the actor to explore, actively explore from their own sense of it, kind of these alternate choices. And the good thing, and the choices specifically that I think are important, revolve around vulnerability, and a kind of terror that comes from that feeling of vulnerability, and the vulnerability especially of that we all feel when we put our trust in other people. We love other people. We risk loving and trusting other people, because they can hurt us. They can wound us. They can, they wield a very strong power over our lives. And that can be terrifying at times. And that's not just for kings, it's for everybody. And so I think he embodies a lot of that. And the beautiful thing about Elijah, Elijah and I worked at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival on a commedia show, so pure comedy. And he's such a brilliant comedic actor, and so delightful. And he's just a formidable Shakespearean tragic, actor as well. And I had not experienced that aspect of his abilities until this project. So it was such a joy to get in there with him. But he had played this role in a production directed by the wonderful Rob Melrose, and who I adore and who's brilliant. I had not seen this production, but Elijah came to this project familiar with the role, and his take on the role really, sort of aligned with mine in a lot of ways, which had to do with sort of this question of feeling vulnerable, feeling nakedly, not empowered in the face of a kind of love for not only his wife, who's pregnant with another child of theirs, which is also, from what he would say, that feeling of vulnerability that comes when your wife is getting ready to have a child. And I'm sure you can speak to this, Michael. But, that kind of sense that everything's going to change. The dynamics are, of course, going to be changing. And where's my place in that dynamic? And will I be sort of sidelined in my wife's eyes in terms of importance, and any of those kind of feelings. And in addition, he's got this longtime childhood friend in this other king, Polixenes, played by the wonderful Rodney Gardner, who, they go way back to childhood. And there's a vulnerability there in terms of a deep, deep friendship and deep, deep love between these two men, aspects of which, involve a lot of complexity and a lot of vulnerability. And for, male friendships, there's a lot to say about how those attachments get formed and how they navigate adulthood and kind of world of the expectations of men, in a lot of ways, in our power structures of society, yada, yada, patriarchy. So that's all to say that there's more than maybe just anger and kind of rage. That's how a lot of it manifests in terms of what happens. The king, because he's king and he wields a lot of power, he can accuse people and send them to prison immediately. And, he can say what he thinks is true and what he doesn't think is true. And that will have a lot of real life consequences for everyone involved because he wields power in that way. But what's driving all that is, what's underneath all of that is I think Elijah really felt, and I would concur, a sort of real feeling of disempowerment and weakness, and not firm footing within himself or with the people surrounding him. And that sort of view onto the material, I think fundamentally challenges and undermines this kind of surface read on the thing, which is that he's just gone mad and he's just raging, So that's fundamentally, I would say. Plus, I think that Shakespeare, in his wonderful way, which I think doesn't get mined a lot of the time, is that role is written with a lot of humor, strangely enough. He does horrible things, but the writing, the language, there's a lot of moments that are funny. Uh, the guy's got a good sense of humor. And I think that that's part of what can be also rich and horrifying and relatable about him. And I think that for me is the important thing, is that this character, that we not distance ourselves from this character and think, oh, he's some other thing. I would never be that way. No, it's actually, to me, what's most interesting and kind of useful about the play is that we recognize ourselves in all the characters, really, but in this character too. What we're all capable of and what's driving that, if we don't listen to those things and sort of tend to them within our own hearts.
You have, as you said, been working on this play more or less for the past 10 years, on and off, right? The translation, and then there have been readings, there have been productions of your translation. What made this experience unique for you, turning the play into a podcast series and making it strictly an oral experience for the listener?
I will say that it's been revelatory. It's been as far as, I'm so glad, by the way, that this was the play to have had the opportunity to transform into a podcast oral storytelling situation, because I never worked on a podcast before. I'd never done, years ago with the Actors Gang. I know we're going to talk a little bit about the Actors Gang. We used to do these things in bars that we would call radio plays, in that kind of old timey way, where we would set up microphones and just stand at a microphone and read original stories like you would listen to on the radio back in the olden days. But that was the closest I ever had come to anything involving what we would think of as podcasts. So, obviously the language of Shakespeare is incredible and lends itself to deep listening. And, in a general sense, I would say that, and maybe I would love to hear your thoughts about this also, Michael, but when you take away the visual aspect, right, when you take away one of the senses, the other senses that remain become more acute, become more tuned in. And in the case of Shakespeare, that's all for the good, because what you're listening to in the language, there's so much there, potentially, and the nuanced work of good actors brings forth so much to absorb when you're listening. So the potential for that, what you kind of maybe sacrifice in some of the visual spectacle, or, as I mentioned, the sort of final scene in this play involves a kind of visual spectacle that we had to find a different way around in this storytelling. But what you gain is all of that, the listening, the deep listening, the potential for that. And in this particular play, what that affords is a way to possibly get more inside the interior of the lead character Leonte's head, in a way that you just don't have when you're watching a traditional presentation of the play in a theater. And I've really been interested in that aspect of it, because I think that that's one of the kind of central questions of the play is, what is he thinking? How is he thinking? He talks a little bit about how he's thinking. There's a very famous speech where he talks about a spider being steeped in a cup, and that he's, if you don't see the spider in the cup and you drink from the cup, nothing happens to you. But if you come to the realization that there is a spider in your cup and you've drunk the spider, well, then you start to panic, and, you start choking and you freak out that you've been poisoned. And he says, I've drunk and I've seen the spider. So I'm aware
that in your relationship with this play, what have you come to understand the symbolism of the spider being?
I think that, in a broad sense, I don't know how, it's debatable how self-aware Leontes is in that moment when what he thinks the spider is. There's a lot that could be said about that. But I think from Shakespeare's point of view, perhaps, there's an awareness of my mind. I've allowed my mind to become poisoned. I've allowed, and I think we all can maybe relate to this thing of, there are certain crossroads of our thinking, maybe when we look upon situations and we determine what we think is going on over there with whatever it might be, what someone's motivations might be for the way that they're presenting to us. And if we allow ourselves to kind of cycle in, bad places of paranoia, that can grow and that can poison our minds in such a way that it can spin into, high drama, high rev. And so the thing that I think is important, I hope I'm not being too long-winded about this, but there's what Shakespeare does with the opening scene of the play, which really is the crucial scene for any director to kind of tackle in the play, because we're watching this queen and Leontes, her husband, Leontes the king, and his best friend, Polixenes the king, have this sort of wonderful laughing, a little bit bawdy, a little bit, it's got some teasing and some, sexy joking and a little bit of this and that, in there for fun. But it's not impossible to look over at the interchanges between Hermione, played by the amazing Gina Daniels in our piece, to look over at the two of them, his friend and his wife, and think, hey, they seem kind of too into each other. They seem very kind of flirty. And what's that about? And at that juncture is where, maybe the spider is presenting itself in the cup. Are you going to drink that? Are you going to drink that sip with that spider in it and let that thing go into your system? Are you going to say, you know what? They are being too flirty. I think there's something going on here. And if there is, man, this is horrible. I mean, she's 9 months pregnant with a child. He's been staying here at our castle for 9 months. What am I supposed to think about that? This is obviously a massive betrayal. Or, the spider stays hidden and he doesn't think of that at all. He just enjoys the company of his wife and his dear friend, who he trusts in his heart are both, as faithful and loving to him as he is to them.
So it's either I crush this thing, or I ignore it, or I ingest it and let it become everything that I have feared.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely one read on that spider, and because I think I'll speak for myself. I go through that kind of thing all the time, a kind of, what did that person mean by that? Oh, Are they offended by what I said? Oh, did I, are they, are they saying things behind my back? Do they think I'm a jerk? Are they going to leave me out? I don't know, whatever those fears are. Right. And then I make an effort in my old age to, have another part come in and say, oh, hold on a minute. Let's just take a breath. Let's try to look upon things with generosity and love as much, of the actions of others, as much as we would want that reciprocated towards us. Mm-hmm. And there's different ways of, trying to, there's never a moment where he goes to either of them and says, hey, you guys, I'm feeling a little bit freaked out right now. I just wanted to process this for a minute. He doesn't really take that step. He just goes straight to the, I'm sending you to prison. And, and he asks,
there's too many spoilers. Just completely take over and rule him.
Right. And translate into, extreme action. He begins, his own sort of murder plot against his friend. Sort of, I mean,
instead of a spider is a very helpful being that eats lots and lots of bugs, and it's not
Yes,
going to
that's
hurt you.
right.
Just
It's
leave it
good to
alone.
have spiders.
Yes.
And, and though we want to, keep them in their, keep all the natural world in its sort of proper proportions somehow. But spiders are amazing.
And an incredible, really an incredible symbol throughout. I mean, as a sort of a jumping off point for this entire web of a story,
And
that
isn't
just
that
goes.
the thing, just lastly, about humans, right? Like that impulse to kill,
Mhm.
and to say the natural world even being a threat, right?
Mhm.
And we develop all these mechanisms by which to limit the sort of natural processes of the natural world, right? But then we come to realize, like, oh, actually, all that stuff helps us, that it helps the ecosystems that we need to function. So I don't know. That's a
Yeah.
macro, right? On the Leontes thing. Like
We
go
yeah.
on.
We talked a lot about how do we accomplish the sort of the transformations that happen with characters and whatnot in this story. One of the things that I think has been so kind of interesting to see evolve was the use of laughter. It seems like it was maybe, and I don't know offhand if you had written in some of the sound direction or if it was Catherine Eaton, our adapter, who had kind of got the ball rolling there. But I know we kind of ran with it. Can you talk a little bit about that and how laughter is utilized, not just, I mean, throughout the entire series?
Yes. Yeah, I think that as far as I can remember, I think it had a pretty organic evolution. I didn't come into this thinking specifically. I mean, I did fairly early on, only because, of course, the great thing, and I'm always about this is what the working in Commedia taught me, which is limitations are creative people's friends in a lot of ways, because when the choices are limited, it really helps you focus in on, you're not stuck with, like, it could be anything. We could do anything. It's no, you can only do maybe just within this bandwidth, a sort of, there's some choices that are going to work in this and others that won't. So for an oral only presentation, of course we're thinking, well, what is it about sounds that it's going to tell this story? What is it that is something that we hear that's going to carry the feelings? It's not going to be visual. So what does that mean? Well, definitely. So laughter pretty organically, I think, surfaced, time and again, as one motif. And like I mentioned a moment ago, I mean, the crucial sort of opening scene has to do with this threesome of dear friends, who are just, yucking it up, like having a grand old time with telling jokes and laughing. And it's anything but a sort of suspicious feeling, moment. There's no one's holding back. It's the wine is flowing and the laughs are coming. And it's out of this laughter that this suspicion starts to form, this familiarity of laughter. So there's a kind of, there's a little bit of a paradox there, a little bit of a contradiction in terms of how laughter, it's an expression of joy, but it can also be heard as, it can also be heard as mockery. It can also be heard as making fun or a conspiratorial sort of bond between two people that the other person isn't aware of. It can take a lot of sort of more fraught turns. And so that lent itself very well to exactly what's happening here. And also because of course, back to this idea of the problem play, which contains comedy and tragedy sort of mixed together. Laughter is a great tool for highlighting that story. We had the opportunity to, get up, as I said, get up inside Leontes' head. And, when we think we're being laughed at, as opposed to being laughed with, that has a whole that brings us to a whole different place of how we feel about that. And that's what's happening with him, is this paranoia about being laughed at, being mocked and laughed at, not only by those two who he believes are betraying him, but also by others who are looking upon the situation, the people in his kingdom, the onlookers, adjacent people, everyone thinks I'm an idiot. Everyone thinks I'm blind to what's going on under my nose and I'm just a fool. He goes up on that tangent. And then, of course, but the play has spoiler, the play has, I think, what Shakespeare intended as a true classic happy ending. A reuniting and a rebirth of love and joy and possibility and friendship, and a reclamation of all that was sort of laying dormant for many years. And so, of course, that means laughter. And so you get a kind of full arc and scope of the story through just sort of examining and tracking the laughter and the types of laughter that are surfacing throughout the play. And of course, then there's this whole sort of middle section where we go to a completely different place, this country called Bohemia, where it's populated with basically Shakespearean clowns. So you're just getting, at that point we go from Shakespeare's verse to Shakespeare's prose, and it's a lot of foolishness and humor. So and hopefully laughter from the audience too. So it's laughter, it's a big thing in this.
We go to an unspeakably tragic place. I mean, and we lose
Beyond.
Mamilius dies, the little boy. It seems like Hermione is dead. And we have Leontes just racked with grief.
Yes.
And then suddenly there's this like wrenching change where we leap over the 16 years and we're immediately almost invited to laugh. We've got Autolycus, the clown, coming out. It makes me, that duality, we talk so much in these interviews about how Shakespeare dives into the duality of what it is to be human.
Yes.
And it also reminds me of conversation we had with Jeff Whitty, who translated A Midsummer Night's Dream.
Yes.
And he described learning that laughter physically is almost identical in terms of the muscle and the breath and the mind and what happens to sobbing.
Right. Yes. Good observation. Absolutely. Yes.
In this almost like a split second, right? I mean, we make this complete 180. Right.
And that's kind of a really beautiful thing. And it also brings to mind that, I was mentioning sort of the comedy that he gives to Leontes, even in the midst of this hideousness that's happening. And within the world of the clowns, in Bohemia, there's also, there's very high stakes and dire situations that go on there as well. And I think that's, back to, we could talk endlessly about, obviously we're all great lovers of Shakespeare's work, and there's so much that we could just go on and on about, obviously, but that really is one of the things that I most hold dear and enjoy and appreciate about his writing, is that closeness of the joy and the sorrow, and how that physically manifests, to Jeff's point about the sort of diaphragm heaving. And that made me think of a Joni Mitchell lyric, laughter and crying, it's the same release.
Mm-hmm.
She wrote. And, we should do more laughing and more crying, I think. All of us.
Absolutely.
That's what we need. Yeah.
The play makes this, the play makes this leap in time. It's kind of interesting and apropos that, you dove into A Wrinkle in Time before working on this.
Right.
How did that come about? And how did it, I guess, what is the source of that journey? I know it has a lot to do with Bill Rausch and Cornerstone. Can you take us down that path, how you ended up working on A Wrinkle in Time and some of the other projects you did at OSF?
Sure. Yes. Well, Bill Rausch, the extraordinary Bill Rausch, just a phenomenal theater artist and artistic director who started along with Allison Carey and a group of other actors who came out of ART years ago, started a company called Cornerstone. And there's so much to say about Cornerstone, but they sort of traveled the country going into different towns and doing plays with non-professional actors, people they would find and meet in the town, and really a journey of that theater company. And eventually ended up in Los Angeles, where I was based, where I grew up. And so that's how I came to meet Bill and work with Cornerstone. Then Bill, in 2008, I believe, ended up taking over the artistic directorship of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival and was there for many years. So during the time that he went to OSF, he so generously and delightedly for me brought me up there to direct some shows and to adapt a couple of plays. I started out with a commedia play called The Servant of Two Masters, which is one of the more well-known commedia plays. And that's because my old theater company, the Actors Gang, their foundations of performance were also based in commedia, which we could talk about commedia and what it all is and isn't. But anyway, it's an improvisational comedic form. And so I adapted The Servant of Two Masters and directed a production there. And I wanted to mention that the two adaptations of the sort of commedia plays I did at OSF were both done co-adaptations with an amazing writer named Oded Gross. And he's a phenomenal comedic writer based out of New York. And so we did those two adaptations. I directed the productions. And then a couple of years later, he got the rights to produce a production of A Wrinkle in Time and write a new adaptation of it. And Bill is sort of the master of getting permission to adapt pieces that are notoriously like no one is ever going to get permission to do this. And then Bill goes and does it. And that's just all to his phenomenal persuasive abilities and beautiful artistry. But so I don't know, he had his own kind of calculation about why he thought that piece might be a good one for me to adapt. The book is, of course, so beloved, so well known. So many people have just treasured that book from their childhoods. And I felt a lot of, I felt just a strong awareness and even a little bit of pressure to a self-made pressure to try to bring some essence of what is so meaningful to so many people about that book, somehow try to translate that to the stage. And that kind of became my guiding principle, which normally wouldn't necessarily be, I wouldn't normally be approaching any adaptation in that way. But for that particular piece, I just really felt moved by the way that, when people love books, of course, it's so wonderful because books are so wonderful. And those childhood connections of the things that we love as children, they run deep. And to examine sort of why is that? What is it about this book, that touches people and stays with them their whole lives? So, and of course, Oregon Shakespeare Festival is a place where multiple generations of people will come back to that place. So, people will come when they're children and they're brought there by their parents or grandparents. And then years later, they bring their own kids because that place has been around for so many years. And so I was also aware of that intergenerational aspect of the audience and wanting to speak to that somehow, so that the adults who were coming, a lot of them would have had that attachment to the book. And then, of course, the children who were coming may or may not, but we're getting exposed to it in that way, maybe for the first time. So that's my long-winded. So long-winded. I am just the most long-winded. I can't do a short answer. This is the problem, Michael.
Well, I mean, these projects that we work on as artists take over our lives. So there's no way to give a concise short answer to a broad question like what was the journey on that project.
I could work on being more successful. When we were doing the thing, when we were recording this.
Yep, we got to do the take, Tracey. You got to do the take.
Could you wrap it up?
Wrap it up.
We need to move on.
Don't worry. Every director gets that note from me when we're doing these recordings. And time is the enemy in a way. I mean, when we do these, everybody wants more time. Everybody wants more time. And yet, to your point about like actors and directors and artists in general really respond well to limitations, right?
Yes.
I mean, if there are limitations, we are spurred into making intuitive choices, I think, especially when it comes to time, right? So
very true.
This concludes part 1 of my interview with Tracey Young. Be sure to listen next week to part 2. You can learn more about the Play On Podcasts at Next Chapter Podcast website, ncpodcast.com. That's N as in next, C as in chapter, podcasts with an S at the end.com, where you can find other Play On podcast series and interviews, along with talk podcasts like The 500, The 10, The Tough Juice podcast with Karan Butler, and a whole lot more. I'd like to thank Jeremiah Tittle, the founder of Next Chapter Podcasts, and our producer, Peter Musto. Our audio engineer and editor is Justin Cortese. Be sure to subscribe to Next Chapter Podcast for updates on all the latest content, and don't forget to rate and review our shows. I'm Michael Goodfriend, and I look forward to sharing more incredible works with you in the Play On Podcast series, along with lots of enlightening bonus content at Next Chapter Podcast.
Looking for an RPG podcast that isn't just D&D?
Roll to Cast is the answer.
No, wait, sorry. What games have we played so far?
Well, we've done Cyberpunk 2020,
Hulk Cthulhu,
Vampire the Masquerade,
The Witcher,
Kids on Bikes,
Avatar Legends,
And Cyberpunk Red.
Roll to Cast,
ROLE,
A new game every season.
original music.
original stories,
interviews with the creators.
And delightful Aussie accents.
Listen to us on all good podcatchers.
You can support us on Patreon for bonus content.
That's Roll to Cast.
ROLE.
Come discover a new world.
Next Chapter Podcasts.